Okay, this is the installation instruction video series for the Honda EU3000iS generator for my long-range remote control system. The first step to installing it is going to be to remove the back cover of the generator. The back cover is held on with 4 acorn nuts. The acorn nuts that hold the plastic covers on, the rear and the front plastic cover, you'll notice have a large flange. So if you do have several panels off at the same time, like on the front, there are acorn nuts on the small metal panel. The acorn nuts that go on the metal panel down below have a small flange, where these from the rear plastic panel have a large flange. Go ahead and slide the rear cover off. When you slide the rear cover off, there are 4 metal inserts that go into the cover and around each of the studs. So make sure that all 4 of them are either in the plastic cover or that they are still on the studs. At any rate, don't lose them. The next thing is there's a foam gasket that goes through this groove, and when you pull the cover off, you'll see that right here in this corner the foam gasket has popped out a little bit, and in this corner the foam gasket has popped out, and that's really quite common. Just go ahead and tuck it back into place. And the whole purpose of this foam gasket is simply for sound deadening. This generator is a really quiet generator, and we'd like to keep it that way. Okay. Next step is going to be to remove the grill off of the exhaust. The grill is just held on with 4 bolts with 10mm heads. The 4 bolts that hold the grill on have a flange. They're just 6mm bolts with a 10mm head. They are identical to the bolts that hold this bottom panel on, except for the bolts in the bottom panel are painted black. The ones that hold the exhaust grill are silver. Just keep the black ones down here. It just looks nicer. The next step is going to be to remove the handle. The handle is held on with 4 8mm bolts that have 12mm heads. Now take the rear lower panel off. It also uses 4 6mm bolts with 10mm heads on them. And these are the ones that are painted black. working on a generator that's California approved, or after 2013, it'll have a purge canister for emissions. In that case, it'll have a hole in the cover for this hose to come out of. If it is a non-California approved model, there will be no purge canister, there will be no hole here. What I'm going to do now is pull the fiberglass heat shield off the back of the generator. The easiest way to do that is to rock the top of it out, then the bottom of it. If it is non-California approved, fiberglass heat shield comes all the way down on this side as well as this side. What I'm going to have to do is hook my fingers around the front and spread it out just a little bit to get it to come out over the cleats. As you see the motor mounts down here, the heat shield curves in under it, so you have to wiggle it out very gently. Okay. The whole purpose of pulling this whole back part off was in order to mount a temperature sensor right to this little flange by the exhaust manifold. The temperature sensor is going to control the choke so that it does not attempt to choke when the engine is already warmed up. This is the temperature sensor. It comes in the kit. What you'll be doing is mounting the temperature sensor right to this flange. Make certain that you don't get it touching the nut. I'm not concerned about it touching the nut with respect to grounding out. I just don't want, because this is a thinner panel, the panel will tremble or vibrate at engine RPMs, and I don't want it touching that because then it'll wear back and forth and possibly damage the temperature sensor. And since it's so easy to go ahead and mount it over to where you do have a slight gap, let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to mark where the bottom hole goes. I'm going to take a drill with a 1/8 drill bit, and I'm going to drill a hole. The kit comes with screws to mount the temperature sensor in place. Take one of the screws, put it in the bottom hole of the temperature sensor, just to mark the spot, just to hold it in place. Then we're going to go ahead and punch where the top screw hole goes. I'm going to go ahead and remove the sensor while I drill the hole. You can use a magic marker or a punch, or I use an automatic center punch, whatever works best for you, to mark the location of the holes. Now we have two holes, one for each of the screws on the temperature sensor. When I mount the temperature sensors, I prefer to mount them this way as opposed to like this. The reason being, if this terminal touches the bolt, this is a ground screw anyway. This terminal needs to be grounded. I just don't want it to touch the bolt because of vibration. So if you mount it like this and it does accidentally touch, it won't wind up choking the motor all the time. Whereas if you got it like this and this one touches, the motor will choke whether it's hot or cold, and we don't want to risk that. So I'm going to put the sensor in place and put the top screw in. And I'm just going to put it in a couple of turns just to get it started. Then I'm going to take the ring terminal and wrap it around and put it around the bottom screw, and then run the bottom screw through the sensor, and then go ahead and tighten down both the screws. Incidentally, the drill bit that I used was a 1/8 inch drill bit. I don't recommend going to a larger drill bit because these screws can be turned down into a 1/8, and that way they bite nicely. Then take the wire that comes from the temperature sensor, and we're going to feed it through to the front of the engine area. There's a rubber grommet around this heat shield that goes between the heat shield right here and this edge heat shield. We're just going to push the rubber grommet back just a little bit, and the wire will slide right through there. If you see, that rubber grommet moves quite easily. I'm going to push a screwdriver through from this end. And there's my wire. Once I get the wire routed through, then you can slide it down. Now you'll notice these two hoses, these go to the purge canister, and they are only on the California approved versions. So if you have an earlier version or a non-California approved, you won't have these hoses getting in the way, which will actually make your job easier. You'll only want to pull about 6 inches of the wire into this cabinet area. Then come around to the back. Make certain that this wire isn't being pinched or burned to the engine block or something like that. Just route it to where it's a nice gentle loop. If this wire does get shorted to the engine block, it will choke whether it's hot or cold. And that's what we want to avoid. The whole purpose of this sensor is to make it choke or not choke based on engine temperature. So now we have plenty of play in the wire, and it's not going to get scratched against anything. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and put this rear cover back on because we're finished with this portion of the job. Unfortunately, it's even trickier to get the cover back on than it was to take it off. What you can do, if it makes your life easier, is simply unscrew these bottom studs. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and do it that way, just to demonstrate it. With these studs out of the way, the cover slides in a lot easier. Make sure the top goes under these studs. As I said, it's easier, not easy. Okay, when you get the fiberglass cover in place correctly, you notice that there are two metal tabs from the bottom frame that hold the bottom of the fiberglass cover in place correctly. Make sure that those tabs are outside of the fiberglass cover. If you chose to remove the bottom studs in order to get it in place, go ahead and reinstall those now. Then we'll put the bottom panel with the hole for this. Does that light make it glare on you? Okay. I just noticed sometimes when we put too much light on it, it reflected and glared back in the camera. Make sure that your hose from the purge tank comes out through it. Like I said, if you do not have the California approved model, you don't have a purge tank or a hose, so your problem is solved. Next step is to go ahead and put the handle on. I know it's counterintuitive. It always seems like the grill should go on before the handle. However, if you put the grill on first, you can't get at the bolts to put the handle on as easily. Put the handle on and then put the grill over it. Now the grill for the exhaust goes in place, and the exhaust grill is actually what holds the top of the fiberglass cover in place. You'll notice that the holes for the exhaust grill are slightly slotted, so we're going to go ahead and start all four of the bolts. And then I'm going to push the grill forward against the generator and tighten down the bolt that's the closest to the generator base on each side. And that way the grill is slid tight against the generator. Holds the fiberglass heat shield in place very snugly. step for this portion is going to be to take and make sure that all the metal inserts are in the plastic cover, and make sure that the foam gasket is in the groove all the way around the plastic cover, and slide it in place. I'm just opening up the oil fill door, make sure that the oil fill cap and the oil drain have come out through the grommet nicely. Take the 4 acorn nuts with the large flange. Go ahead and put those back in place. Just take a look at it, make sure the grommet's still in place. The foam gasket didn't pop out anywhere along the side. Go ahead and close your oil fill door. And that concludes the installation of the temperature sensor. Okay, before I go taking this apart to install the choke, I'd like to point out how the choke cable is installed. You'll notice that there is a drum with a slot cut in it, and the back side is counterbored where the spring goes in. So when you pull out on the choke knob, the choke closes, you push in, the choke opens. The number one most common technical call I get for my wireless remote control kits is people saying that the choke cable now pops out and it didn't used to do that. The reason is they're putting this drum in backwards. You notice how it's set right now. I'll push the spring out of the way and take the cable out. You notice that the back side of the drum, where the spring used to go, is recessed. The front side of the drum, where the pellet goes, is not recessed. So you saw it was put in this way. When we put it in backwards, and I'll demonstrate this, so that now the choke drum is in the recessed area. If I pull on the choke to close it and open the choke, the cable pops out. That is the most common mistake people make with my wireless remote control kit. And I always have to explain that you've got the drum in backwards, and they say, oh, that's the way it came, and yeah, right. So this is the way it goes, and if you put the drum on, spin it around backwards, the choke cable pops out. This would be backwards. I just wanted to point this out because this way people can get it done without having to call me if they're doing it in late hours or something like that. But this is in backwards. You choke it. That time it almost popped out. That time it did pop out. So at any rate, that part's covered now. Next step will be to remove the lid from the airbox. There's 4 little clips that you pop out of the way. Not a whole lot of extra room in there. Take the lid off the airbox. Take the filter out. And then if you look in here, you'll see that there is 1 bolt with a 10mm head and two 10mm nuts. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the vent hose for the crankcase ventilation line from the airbox. Taking the two nuts off and the bolt. We'll wiggle the airbox out just a little bit and slowly push this hose that comes from the purge canister back out of the way enough so we can get a hold of it with a pair of needle nose and go ahead and pull it the rest of the way out. This hose simply pushes into a hole in the back of the airbox. Now if you'll notice, there's a hose that goes from one of the metal lines going back to the purge canister, goes into clamps in the back of the airbox and hooks onto the fuel tank. In order to make your life just a little bit easier, you take a magic marker, and before you undo that hose, just make a line across the bottom of the hose so you can see how high the hose went into that clamp. And we'll get back on that during reassembly. I know it seems kind of dumb now, but later on it might actually make your life easier. And then we pulled the airbox the rest of the way out. There's a metal spacer that goes between the airbox and the choke mount bracket. Just make sure that that didn't fall down inside the generator. And let's take a break for just a moment. Okay. The next step is going to be to pull the front cover off. The front cover is held on with 4 acorn nuts, same as the back cover. Incidentally, the reason that I'm taking my time and going through every bolt, nut, washer, and screw on the installation procedures is that my website is worldwide, and the website is available in 68 languages. However, the videos are only available in one language, and if somebody is watching this and they do not speak English, hopefully they won't need to understand what I'm saying. They can simply watch the video and see what I'm doing. The front cover is just like the rear in that it has the metal inserts going through the cover. You notice this one's stuck to the stud, so I'm going to go ahead and put it back in the cover. It also has a foam gasket, which you'll notice has popped up. And we're just going to go ahead and tuck that foam gasket back into place. The next item will be to remove the fuel selector valve. We're going to remove the fuel selector valve knob so we can pull the control panel off. For that, use a long number 2 screwdriver, Phillips head. Remove the knob. Next item to be removed is going to be the control panel itself, and it's held on by 4 10mm bolts, one at each corner. If it makes it easier for you when you're disassembling the generator, put all the fasteners in their own separate location, or to lay it out on a workbench or a floor, whichever way makes the most sense to you. Go ahead and do that. Now before we slide the control panel out, you'll notice the choke cable runs behind the fuel selector valve. So I'm going to go ahead and push the spring right here out of the way so we can disengage the choke cable. And then push the choke cable down below the fuel selector valve to give us a little bit of room to work. There. When we drop the choke cable down below the fuel selector valve, now the control box folds out and down. So at this point, you can see the back of the control panel, and this is where most of the work is going to be done. First item, there is a 6-pin connector. It goes to the ignition switch. The ignition switch is visible right here in the front. If you look at the back of it, you can see it right below the main harness. Disconnect the 6-pin connector and take the harness from the ignition switch and route it up out of the way. I'm going to go ahead and completely remove the ignition switch from the generator for this next step. It is not critical that you remove the ignition switch from the generator completely. It just makes it a lot easier to videotape it. If you do decide to remove the ignition switch completely, it's called an antenna nut socket, but you can do it either, or excuse me, an antenna nut. You can loosen it up either with a large pair of pliers or an antenna nut socket. But the retaining ring just screws on. Then there's a small white insulator right here, and that goes on the outside. Then if you just lift up on the wiring harness, the ignition switch comes out in one piece. And that's probably as good a place as any to go ahead and take a break. Okay, if you look at the back of the stock ignition switch, you'll see that the position of each of the wires is numbered. And there's a blue wire that is on position number 2. We need to remove the blue wire from position number 2 and solder it to this tab, which is position number 6. You'll see a small number 6 next to it. So we just heated it up a little bit and the solder melted away. And now we're going to go ahead and move it to the number 6 position. What we'll do is we'll bend it around in a circle and we'll heat up that tab. If you need to add extra solder, go for it. This particular one looks like there's enough solder on it. We can heat it up and put it in place. Okay. You can see that the blue wire has now been removed from position number 2 and put in position number 6. Now we'll go ahead and reinstall the ignition switch. You'll notice that there is a tab on the bottom of the ignition switch. That's simply to index it so that the key will be in the right position when it's in the off position or on position or start position. You'll see on the outer housing that little tab goes into a slot that's in the 5 o'clock position, right down here. Then you put the white insulator ring on it, and in the antenna nut. And then we'll snug it down just snug. And that's probably as good a place as any to take a break for a moment. Okay, do not plug the ignition switch back in at this time. I'll come later. The kit includes a piece of Velcro. Take the Velcro piece and remove the backing, and then stick the Velcro to the end of the control box, right here. If you'll come in, you'll see where the 2 bolt holes that the bolts go through to locate the control box to the generator base. Try to center it vertically between those 2 bolts. Then take the radio that comes with the kit. You notice that the radio already has a piece of Velcro corresponding stuck to the back of that. Take the radio and push it up tight against this flange and center it right between these 2 bolts, and then push it in place so that the radio is now even with the front cover, and vertically it's centered between where these 2 bolts are going to go. Taking a test fit is a nice idea. Take the antenna wire, and just to keep it out of place for now, the antenna is a magnetic base. Go ahead and stick it to the top of the fuel tank. You'll see the antenna wire is draped loosely out of the way. Later on it will be routed correctly. Take the wiring harness and loop it around to where it follows the main harness in to the back of the control box. You'll have 1 white wire with a female bullet connector, and that'll hang outside the control box. So double it back so it hangs outside the control box. Then take the black wire with the ring terminal and keep it outside the control box. What I do is just put the wires in a nice gentle arc, and then use zip ties included in the kit to zip tie them to the main harness. And that simply keeps it organized so that during the rest of the assembly you can see where everything is and it's not getting in your way. So one zip tie down here does the trick for that. Then you'll notice that there are two plugs on the radio kit that correspond to the ignition plug. The ignition plug, I'm going to route it under the main harness because you'll see that there is a recessed area down here that we can tuck the wires into. So I'm going to route the ignition switch plug underneath this main harness here and plug it in to this harness. Like so. And just look at the locking tab on it. Make sure that the locking tab has locked correctly in place. Then I'm going to take that and push this into the recessed area right here to where it's out of the way. Then take the wiring harness that used to plug into the ignition switch and plug it in to the corresponding plug on the radio harness. And again, squeeze it until the locking tab plugs in. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to tuck it right down here. All the wires have a little bit of extra length to them. It's always easier to install the kit if the wires are a little too long, because you can route the wires out of the way somewhere, and if the wires are slightly too short, there's nothing you can do about it. So on this kit, I'm going to go ahead and pull some of the excess wire to where it's outside the control box. That way the wire that's inside the control box is a lot easier to tuck out of place. So now you have a tan wire going to the relay and two yellow wires. I'm going to go ahead and put an additional zip tie around these just to hold everything in place neatly. And that'll be zip tying the radio's harness to the main wiring harness. And then I will cut the end of the zip tie. And that's probably as good a place as any to take a break for a moment. Okay. Now you've got two yellow wires that are coming out of the radio. You notice one has a simple splice connector on it. The other has a .187 spade terminal on it. If you go to the back of the economy mode switch, there is a green wire with a white tracer. Unplug it from the back of the economy mode switch and take the yellow wire that has the .187 spade connector and plug it onto the back of the economy mode switch right where you removed the green wire with the white tracer from. Then take the green wire with the white tracer and cut the .187 spade connector that was on it off. Then strip about 7 to 8 millimeters of insulation off the end of the green wire of the white tracer. Take the splice connector, fit that in, and crimp that together. And then you can tuck those right down next to the main harness as well. And that takes care of the economy mode function on it. And now you have a relay, and this relay is going to be used to control the outlet. The easiest way to do the outlet is to just remove the outlet from the control panel itself. And that's done with 2 Phillips head screws, one in the top and one in the bottom. Be careful not to drop the nut. It's on the inside. That would be the top screw. There's the bottom nut. Then you can lift the outlet out of the generator housing, or out of the control box housing, so you can get at it. You'll see that there is a large red wire that runs from the 20 amp circuit breaker to the outlet. So what we're going to do is we're going to loosen the Phillips head screw that large red wire is held in place with. You'll see that the red wire has an open ring terminal on it. We're just temporarily going to hold that out of place. You'll notice that there's a jumper that runs from one screw to the other one, right through here. This jumper has to be removed from the side where you removed the red wire earlier. You notice I have removed the jumper now. There used to be two little bands across here. I removed them earlier because unfortunately this is not the first take on this video segment. But at any rate, you'd remove the little jumper that used to go in here. And now, take the red wire and push it back on to that Phillips head screw. And coming out of the relay, there's a red wire and a blue wire with open ring terminals on them too. Take the red wire and slide it next to the stock red wire so that you will have two red wires on one screw, and tighten that screw down. Can you see it clearly? There are now two red wires. One comes from my relay, the other was stock. Then loosen the bottom screw and put the blue wire from the relay onto it, like so. And as you can clearly see, now the current path, instead of going through the jumper, goes through the relay so that you can turn it on or off. And that's probably as good a place as any to take a short break. Okay, now that you have the red wire and the blue wire attached to the outlet and the jumper removed, we'll go ahead and push the outlet back down into the stock location. Now when you're reinstalling the screws, put the bottom one in first. And you just feed the screw from the bottom in, and we'll put the nut onto the end of the screw. The easiest way to do this is to hold the nut in place with a fingertip and loosely thread the screw from the other side so that now your bottom screw is in place. And now the reason that I recommend doing the bottom screw first is the top screw. You'll notice there's a fourth wire coming from the relay, and it's a black wire with a ring terminal on it. The top screw is also going to go through that ring terminal. So what we'll do is we'll push the top screw through the hole where the outlet goes. Then we'll lay that last black wire onto the screw, and then we'll put the nut in place. snug it down, and then go back to the bottom screw, which is still merely finger tight, and snug it down. Okay, now take the relay and find an area that's not congested to tuck it into. And right down here at the bottom, between the two outlets, looks like as good a place as any. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take another one of the ties included in the kit and tie wrap the wires from the relay to the main harness. We'll cut the end of that tie wrap off. And over here I'll take the tan and the two yellows and tie wrap that to the main harness. So now just check and make sure that there are no wires that look like they're being pinched or look like they could get pinched when you put the main control box back together again. Everything looks like it's in good shape. So being careful not to tear the antenna wire or anything else. Incidentally, you'll notice when we had the control box folded out, the white wire from the starter got pulled loose. Don't concern yourself with that yet. We'll put that back together later. Well, we're going to go ahead and put the control box back into place. Make sure everything looks nice. I'm only going to put the top two bolts loosely onto the control box at this time. And those are the silver-headed 6mm bolts. So we've got the top one on the left side and the top one on the right side, just threaded in loosely. Now, if you take a flashlight, shine it in this side, you'll see that the choke cable is no longer behind the fuel selector valve. So what we'll do, come around the front, make sure everything's lined up there. Then we'll just take the choke cable right here and push it back to the stock position. So now you see that the choke cable goes in through the front of the control panel, is routed around behind the fuel shutoff valve, and then comes around right here. We're going to leave it setting disconnected right now because one of the next steps is going to be to hook up the choke mechanism. I just wanted to point out that the choke cable needs to go behind the fuel selector valve, otherwise it'll become entangled. That's probably as good a place as any to take a short break. Okay, now if you come back over to the starter motor, there is a black wire that's tucked back in here, right next to the white one that got pulled loose on us. The black wire starts at the battery post and then goes up to the control or the starter motor. Unplug the black wire. Included in the kit is a blue wire with a female 4mm bullet connector and a male 4mm bullet connector, and then a ring terminal. Take the male 4mm bullet connector from the black wire that goes to the battery, plug that in to the female bullet connector of the blue wire included in the kit, and make sure you push it all the way in to where it's a nice, good, tight snap. Then take the male 4mm bullet and plug it into the 4mm female bullet on the black wire to the starter motor, and push that in till you feel a nice firm snap. And then take the white wire that got pulled loose on us earlier and go ahead and plug that back together. And you should also feel a nice firm snap. Okay, this one here, I can tell why it pulled loose, because when I plugged it back together, it did not make a nice firm click. So I'm going to take the end of it and just squeeze that female connector just a little bit tighter, so that this time when I plug it together, it makes a nice audible click when it snaps together. And then take the white wire, tuck it back in where it belongs. Take the black wire plugged into the blue wire and tuck that back in there. And now the ring terminal that's on the blue wire goes around the bottom bolt that holds the control box in place. That's why I did not bolt that bolt on earlier. So you'll feed it through the bottom bolt. And you'll thread it down, not tight yet. Then you take the last bolt, and you remember the black wire and white wire that we kept outside the control box. Black wire has a ring terminal on it. The bottom bolt on this side, you'll feed through the ring terminal. And start to tighten this down. Incidentally, if the radio is in such a position that it interferes with you, remember that you put the radio on with Velcro. So if you need to remove it, you can. In fact, it's probably easier to demonstrate what I'm doing here. Now I'll go ahead and tighten down all 4 screws. Excuse me, all 4 bolts. Now that all 4 of those bolts are tightened down, I'll go ahead and position the radio right back into place. You'll notice the antenna wire on the radio is running inside this stud. Incidentally, this is a shielded cable on the antenna wire. You can route it any way you'd like, but under no circumstances should you ever attempt to cut it and resolder it back together. If you cut it and resolder it back together, you're going to change the length of the wire, and it is a tuned length, and you're going to cause problems that way. And also, if you go to solder it back together and you get the outer shield soldered to the inner conductor, it'll totally mess up the antenna. So again, we're going to lay this wire out of place, or out of the way for right now, and stick the magnetic base to the top of the fuel tank. Then, there is the other white wire that went to the radio. If you come around the front, you can see that there's a grommet where the main harness passes through the heat shield. Pass this wire through the same grommet, so that it now comes through to this area. If you look at the airbox, there are 3 metal inserts, the 2 that go around the studs where the carburetor was mounted, and then 1 that goes around the 6mm bolt in the bottom. Just make sure that all 3 of those metal inserts are still in place. If you remember earlier, there's a hose that we made a mark on to show where it goes back. There's clips in the back of the airbox. The top clip, take this clamp that comes with the kit. You notice that there is a notch bent down on the clip, and then there's a piece of rubber. The piece of rubber must stay there. And what it does is it goes around the actuator solenoid, and if that piece of rubber is not there, when the engine is running, it can set up a little bit of a vibration, and it is possible for these to spin. So with that piece of rubber against the metal, it won't spin. So take this clamp and position it tight against the top of the airbox and slid all the way over against the clip where the rubber hose went in, and make sure it's nice and tight in place. And that's where you'll drill a hole, 1/4 inch. Once you see a little bit of black plastic coming out, you now know that the hole location is marked. Don't allow the drill bit to drift toward the top. It's already going to be very, very tight putting the nut on the inside. So we're going to hold the drill bit to where it does not drift towards the top of the airbox, and put a hole in it from the back. If your drill bit does drift a little bit, it's not the end of the world. The airbox is made of plastic and it will flex. We just want to avoid having to have it flex a whole lot. You'll see on the back of the solenoid the 2 wires that come out, and let me stop right here for a moment. The 2 wires are interchangeable. It simply does not matter which one goes where. All this is a magnet. But take the solenoid with the 2 wires closest to the airbox, and by that I mean don't rotate it like this, because it's easier to keep them out of the way if you put them closer to the airbox. If you rotate them up to the top, it'll just be a little bit more difficult for the next step. Don't get too excited about it. It's not like it has to come apart and redo it. And incidentally, the decal is unimportant as to the location of the decal. It's the wires that you want to look at. Some of the decals, the decal was stuck in a slightly different clock rotation. The kit is going to come with 2 flat washers. Take the flat washers off the bolt, and that's only because on the EU3000s this clearance is so tight it is not a flanged bolt. Go ahead and put the bolt through the clamp and into the airbox. You'll notice the little notch on the clamp is there to keep the solenoid from sliding any further this direction. That way it marks it exactly where you need to put it, and it makes it just a little bit easier on the end-use installer to put this together. And you'll see how that's laid out now. Now remember earlier when I said that there's not a lot of room at the top of the airbox, and now you understand just how little room. Take one of the washers included in the kit, and this is simply as a strain relief. Put it over the nut, or excuse me, over the bolt. And that's just going to spread the load over a larger area of the plastic airbox. You'll notice one of the washers is left laying on the bench. Bottom line is, it's not necessary. You only need one washer. So if your kit comes with two, don't let it excite you. The bolt and the nut are both 11 millimeter or 7/16 of an inch, whichever you prefer. The nut is a nylock nut, and that's so that the slight engine vibration will not allow it to come loose. Once you snug it down, it's there. And you'll feel it when it gets tight. The fact that it's a nylock will mean that there's always just a little bit of a tension to it as you're tightening it down. But once it seats down solidly, it's there permanently. Let me show you. This is the metal spacer that goes between the choke mount and the airbox. That with this in place, the head of the bolt is now even with this. You don't want the head of the bolt pushing against the choke mount. But you do want this bolt to be snugged down. So make sure that when you put this metal spacer back on, just take your wrench and just make sure that this is snugged down good, because it is amazing how much vibration these engines will go through. And of course, because it is going through a plastic airbox cover, don't honk down on it real tight. Honk, that's a technical term. I'll use a lot of those later. So now when this goes in, this will line up with the drum. So now we've got the solenoid, or the solenoid body, mounted to the airbox. This is the plunger that's going to go into it. And as you can see, there's not going to be a whole lot of extra room for you. Okay, this part isn't necessary. I'm just going to remove it so that I can explain it a little bit better. Because it's kind of hard to get on video. Okay. This is the choke bracket, and this is the drum that the choke cable went into. The cable runs through here and it engages with this. Here is a pin. This pin, if I slide the carburetor out to the end, goes into this hole in the top of the choke. I don't know if you can see that hole on the camera or not. Can you get a flashlight, get a little bit more light on there? Is that washing the picture out on you, or can you see it? Okay. At any rate, I just wanted you to be able to see this. And here's the drum that I spoke of earlier. The drum is held in place with an E-clip. I'm going to go ahead and pop this E-clip out. You can pop the E-clip out without removing this choke plate. I'm simply doing this to make it a little bit easier to videotape. In fact, it's probably easier if you did leave it back in. But you pop this E-clip out. Now, if you were to be doing it with the choke plate back in there, and you drop the E-clip, which looks like this. If you were to drop that down into the generator, simply shine a flashlight around in there. 3 or 4 hours later, you'll find where you dropped the E-clip. The drum has a washer on it. Set the washer off to the side. You will not be reusing it. What I'm going to do now is go ahead and put this bracket back in place. This pin is going to have to slide into this hole. So take the gasket and put it back in place, and you'll notice that this opening right here goes to the upper right. So it lines up with that opening on the carburetor. Then we slide the carburetor to the end of the studs, so if all this falls apart on you while you're putting it together, now you can see how to put everything back together correctly anyway. Slide the carburetor to the end of the studs. We're going to slide this in, then down, so that that metal pin goes through the hole in the choke linkage. And then push the gasket that we just dropped back up into place. And now what I'm going to do is, before I go any further, I'm going to test, and that is the choke plate. Make sure that that choke plate still moves when I move the choke arm. Now you'll notice that when we pulled the choke plate out, the emissions tube has dropped behind the choke plate. We want this emissions hose, because I wasn't paying attention when I put it together, has to be in front of the choke plate. So we get a chance to redo this. This time, because this is a California emissions version, if yours is non-California, you don't have to worry about that hose. Hold that hose out of the way, put the pin into the choke arm on the carburetor, and then put the piece back in place. I get better with practice, don't I? That went a lot easier that time. Now, take the choke cable. You'll notice the choke cable has a spring on it and a piece of rubber. We're going to take the choke cable. Perhaps I should just remove this again so you can clearly see it. That way if something falls apart on you, you can see what I'm doing. By the third time I reinstall it, it ought to be very easy. We're going to take the choke cable. We're going to slide it into the groove. But this piece of rubber needs to be between these two right here, so that the choke cable goes through the rubber, and that way it holds it in place. And now we hold the emissions hose out of the way, hold the pin in place correctly, slide the carburetor out to the end of the studs, drop the pin into the hole on the end of the carburetor shaft, and slide everything back in. Say that 3 times fast. And we look back in here, make sure that our choke cable is routed behind the fuel selector valve, and you're good to go. Now, take the original spacer that was in front of the choke plate, and again there's a notch. Let me show you right here. Make sure that that's to the upper right as you're facing it. That way everything lines up. And now we're ready to start putting the choke together. This is the plunger for the choke. And it slides into the solenoid body, just like this. Before you put the whole thing together, take it and gun sight it, and you want the choke body to be fairly parallel as you can get it, with the surface that the airbox snaps onto, which is parallel to the carburetor surface. So if you were to hold a straight edge, we're going to call this a straight edge. If you were to hold this against the gasket surface for the carburetor, you'll notice that it is parallel to the body of this plunger. Then also, if it's not parallel, you can take it and twist it to line it up. Then hold it like this and make sure it is parallel with this surface, not angled up or angled down, so that the plunger will flow very smoothly. And that way the choke will open and close as smoothly as possible. And if it is not dead parallel with this surface, you can simply rock it back and forth on this bolt and get it parallel. So now what we're going to do is with the choke bracket in place on the carburetor, you'll remember initially that this washer was in this position and then the drum was in the top of the carburetor arm. On the fuel kits, or excuse me, on my choke assembly, take and put the drum into the carburetor. Then this linkage goes below the carburetor linkage because this drum needs to be as low as possible to clear the emissions hose on the California approved models. The non-California approved models do not have that emissions hose, so we don't have to worry about that. Then take the E-clip again. Now I am just temporarily resting this solenoid on top of the emissions hose just to make assembly a little bit easier. You notice I said easier, not easy. We're going to put that clip into place. Then take a pair of pliers. Oops, almost dropped it. Okay, I did drop it. Okay, so much for round one. Put the plunger back in place. Put the E-clip into the groove where it goes. Take a pair of pliers and attempt for a second time to squeeze that E-clip into place. Okay, the E-clip is in place now. We're going to want the emissions hose to be behind this plunger. Let me take a marker and freshen up this black line that marks the bottom of where the clamp went on the back of the airbox. Now, as you remember, that hose, the line we made, was right even with the bottom of this clamp. Because we've added some height to the airbox here, that line is going to be needed to move up even with this ridge on the back of the airbox. So instead of being at the bottom of the clamp, or the retainer clip, it's now going to be almost to the very top. This whole thing is going to be a little bit tricky. Actually, that's not true. It's going to be a lot tricky. I fold all these clamps into place to make the airbox as small as possible. Then I'm going to push it in there. And on the California approved models, I'm going to snap my emissions hose into this clamp and into this clamp. Then I will push it in and put my plunger in place, making sure that the emissions hose is routed around the back of this. Then I will pull the airbox back this way so that the plunger goes into the body of the solenoid, and then slide it over the studs. And then I'm going to check and make sure that everything worked correctly. So the first step is to slide the carburetor to where it's fairly close to the end of these studs. Not so close that anything falls. But that way, when we get ready to slide this back out this way, we may have to hold with our finger this little spacer bracket. Okay, so the first step is I'm going to push the whole thing back into place. And you'll see where the line is on this hose versus this clip on the airbox. And if you can see, the black line on the hose is just slightly below the top of the clamp. It used to be at the bottom of the clamp. We've just raised the hose up so that it'll curve nicely around the top of the solenoid. Then, I guess we can fold this out of the way right here to make it easier to videotape. Can the camera see this clearly? Okay, good. Then I'm going to take the top hose, or excuse me, the top of the hose, and slide it into the top clamp. And hopefully you can see that on camera still. Now I'm going to take this plunger and I'm going to swing it around. I'm going to slide the air or the carburetor to the end of the studs again. And I'm going to put that plunger into the end of my solenoid body. Right here. Then I'm going to try and gently wiggle the whole mess back toward. Okay, what just fell was one of these metal dowels. You remember that from the earlier discussion. Those go around the studs and around the 6mm bolt. So we'll have to slide that back into place later. But first things first, we want to get all this together before we have gray hair, or before we pull all of our hair out. Okay. Push on the carburetor choke linkage. Make sure that that's still smooth flowing. That's nice and easy flowing. That's good. Now I'm going to take this, I'm going to look in here, and I see that it came off of this stud. So with everything still in place, I'm going to slide this back into place. And now I'm going to put the nuts on the end of those studs loosely. And I'll put the 6mm bolt into the back. And it's just going to be finger tight for now too. Now I'll take the flashlight. I'm just going to look down in there and make sure nothing looks like it's pinched. So far so good. Now I'm going to take this drum and I'm going to rotate it, because remember, this recessed area faces the back and the spring sits into that recessed area, so that when you open and close the choke, it doesn't fall apart. Okay, now take my wrench, go ahead and tighten down these bolts. Excuse me, tighten down the nuts and the one bolt. And we should be good. Again, I want to just make sure that the choke flows smoothly. Now remember, there were two white wires on the back of the solenoid. One white wire that goes to the temperature sensor on the back of the cylinder head. So we take either one of these two white wires, it doesn't matter, because that's just a magnet. We snap it into the wire from the cylinder head temperature sensor. We take the other white wire coming from the front, we put it to the white wire from the solenoid, and then we tuck the wires down and out of the way of the lid of the airbox. Then this is the breather hose we took off. That slides down on this fitting on the top of the airbox. And now this hose. This one is a bit of a pain. I'm not going to joke with you on this. All it does is it slides in to this hole that you pulled it out of. That sounds easy, doesn't it? I've never had one of these yet that didn't put up a fight. Okay, I just did. Eventually, things will work your way. I think it's all that good, clean living. Okay, so now in theory, our choke is pretty much hooked up. Our manual choke works correctly. It doesn't fall apart on us because we have the spring engaged in the recessed area, the back of the drum. And now for the moment of truth, with the key switch, the solenoid should close the choke. So whenever the start motor is engaged, the choke now closes. See if you can get a shot straight in here at the choke shaft. I'm going to move this very slowly, so maybe you can see it or not. You'll have to go straight this way. The choke plate has a spark arrestor over it, just in case the engine backfires. Can't see a thing, can you? Okay, if you put your finger around it, okay, if you put your finger back in there, you can feel the choke plate closing. But we had already examined this before we put the airbox in place. So everything seems to be working correctly. Let's take a break for a moment. Okay, I've got another solenoid plunger out here just to demonstrate this with. When the choke is pulled, it will pull this plunger all the way in. So if you take the choke knob on this and pull out on the choke knob, you'll notice that the plunger goes all the way in so that the center of that pin is just about even with the threaded area. When it's all the way choked, I'm going to go ahead and release the choke. And now we're going to go ahead and test the system. From now on, the generator does not need the manual choke unless the battery is dead, because the electric choke will now activate when the starter motor is activated. So watch the plunger when you do a test on it to make sure that the choke is working correctly. And I'm just going to crank it for a couple seconds. And you'll notice that this one is choking completely. So our electric choke is working, our start solenoid is working, and everything else is working correctly. In fact, if you wanted at this time, take one of the wireless remote key fobs, turn the key to the on position, because the radio is only powered with the key in the on position, extend the antenna on the remote key fob up, slide the pocket protector out of the way so you don't end up accidentally pocket dialing it. But button 1 would engage the starter and the choke solenoid. Then button 2 would shut the generator off. Obviously, because it's not running, it doesn't need to be shut off. Button 3 would turn it in and out of economy mode, but it's not running, so we can't demonstrate that. But at least we have demonstrated that the generator is responding to the radio. And now we can go ahead and start putting it back together. First thing I'll put in is the air filter and the Airbox lid. And that functions identically to the way it did when it was stock. I'll fold the clips out of the way. Slide the air filter in place. And we'll put the Airbox cover in place. And you should hear all 4 of the clamps click shut. The antenna on this has approximately a 50-inch coax cable running to the antenna. If you're going to be mounting this generator in a generator shed or something like that, where you would like the antenna to be mounted on top of the building, you would leave all this wire extended out of the generator housing. But if you're going to be putting the generator outside, like for camping or whatever, then you would leave most of this wire underneath the front cover and just enough wire to let the magnet stick it to the top of the generator. At any rate, what I recommend doing, let me set this right here for now. The wire comes out of the top of the radio unit, putting a small notch in the cover so that this wire will come around to the front of the cover. This would be the front cover right here. This would be the area that I'm discussing. Right between this stud and the top of this housing, so right through here, grind a small notch with a die grinder. Now would have helped if I remembered to turn the compressor on beforehand. But at any rate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grind a small notch in the cover above the stud, but below the top of this opening. So right about here, I'm going to put a small notch just big enough for the antenna wire to fit through. Now, make sure that the foam gaskets are in place all the way around, that the 4 metal spacers are in place. Feed the antenna through this opening. I'm just going to stick it on the gas cap for now. For me, I'm not going to be mounting the generator in a generator shed, so I don't need the antenna wire to run up several feet. So I'm going to take the antenna wire and tuck it right here next to the rest of the wiring harness. Now we're going to go ahead and slide the plastic cover on. Get it right over the studs. Make sure that we don't crimp any wires as we push it into place. If you come around here, you'll see the notch that we ground right into the housing for the antenna wire to come out through, and the antenna wire comes out through that. So now we can feed the antenna under the lift handle and set it on top of the fuel tank. With that, we can go ahead and put the 4 acorn nuts in place. And again, I start all 4 of them before tightening any of them down. The last one is the fuel selector valve with a long Phillips head screwdriver. Go ahead and put the fuel selector valve in place. And remember that the shaft on the fuel selector valve goes below the choke cable. If it were to route above the choke cable, it would cause the choke to bind. Right now I've got my hand in there blocking it. Just a minute and I'll show you. Snug that down. Okay, if you look in here, this is the choke cable. Right here. And that black bar below it is the knob for the fuel selector valve. Okay. Now, the only thing left to do is take it outside and test it.